What's up, guys? It's your boy Chad here. Okay, and if you can't already tell, this is not the type of video I'm used to making. If you look at the rest of my channel, pretty much all the videos, I just collected clips ahead of time, put music in the editor, edited very lightly over it, and just threw it up on YouTube. For this, I'm actually having to record my voiceover and try to express my thoughts to you, so this is not something I'm used to, and I really would appreciate any feedback you can give me. It's important to me that I enjoy the process of making these videos, but if the end product can be something that other people would actually enjoy, that would really make my day. I don't really have the storage space to be recording hour-long runs of this, so I don't have the full start to finish run of my completion. What I'll be commenting over is clips of the various segments with some information you may not have and some tips for how to do it and things to avoid. In an attempt to preserve this video, I'm not going to include any background audio for most of these clips because they contain music and I don't know what's going to get me striked and what's not. And with that Ricacus length intro out the way, let's get into the actual substance of the video. So as you may have seen so far, I showed two ways to do the Sparrow section. Obviously, you can just Sparrow past most of the enemies and they won't shoot you, but if they do target you and you die to that, it feels bad, even though it doesn't waste much time. It's important to instill that mindset early on that rushing and dying because of it is going to waste you more time in the long run than playing safe and getting it done. On top of weird bungee glitches, you also have to deal with even the most minor of enemies killing you unbelievably quickly. When possible, you should play to avoid any possibility of getting hit. There's also a weird bug with Warmind cells in this one area where they just kind of float around and it can lead to them killing a lot of enemies. It can be very entertaining. You'll see it multiple times throughout this video. I started out this challenge using Top Tree Nova with Controverse Hold and 100 Discipline so I could have the Controverse charge nades up all the time, but I very quickly realized that as good as this was for the early game, and actually even dealing with the boss itself, capturing the plates at the very end of the strike is kind of a nightmare on Warlock, and Tether turned out to be much more effective, which is why I completed the run on my Hunter. Warmind's Decree in the artifact allows you to create Warmind cells with void splash damage, and that pairs perfectly with cellular suppression and global reach to effectively blind enemies after tapping your Warmind cell a few times. I started off using an empty vessel with the new perk Danger Zone for the increased blast radius, which does actually affect blinding nades, blinding enemies in a larger radius while you have it procced. And with Wrath of Rasputin, I could actually create Warmind cells with this splash damage as well. Given that you have to run Anti-Barrier and Unstoppable on your gauntlets and don't have room for a grenade launcher reloader, I found having auto-loading on a Truth Teller instead was actually more effective. There are times where Danger Zone comes up, but often in the final boss room when Danger Zone comes up, there are too many enemies already too close to your plate for you to actually complete it. This is one of the first areas that's particularly glitchy in a way that can cause wipes. So it seems like if too many enemies are stacked up in the front, that they can actually teleport behind you and all around the room, and that makes it a lot harder to keep all of them blinded and off the plate. I would recommend after blinding any enemies in front of you, if they're still a decent distance away from the plate, take that second to quickly turn around and check if anything spawned behind you. When I say if they're distant, I mean that if a gladiator is already about to be stepping on the plate in front of you, hitting it with a blinding nade will probably blind things that are behind you as well. In most of the other strikes, enemies are finite on plates, so usually you make some amount of progress on a plate that stays. In this strike, however, you have to complete the entire plate all in one go, or you lose your progress. That means the enemies that are spawning during this segment will actually continue to respawn every time you fail, or if you take too long capturing the plate. If you've run this strike before, you may know that there are two unstoppable champions that usually spawn at the end of your plate run, and you may notice that I haven't had them spawn. Well, as it turns out, if you keep enough of the enemies from the first wave or two of gladiators and dogs alive, and for long enough, it actually seems to just not spawn those champions. As far as I'm aware, in the entire game, these are the only two champions that you can either entirely avoid or have spawn infinitely. Any that spawn do count towards platinum rewards, but if you do avoid them spawning at all, you can get platinum rewards without them. As I learned later, using anarchy actually seems to make these problems a lot more likely to occur, because you're both a lot more likely to kill all the enemies coming out, and a lot more likely to lock enemies in a way where they'll start to spawn behind you. I found it most consistent to just use the blinding nades in the group of enemies to kill some of the dogs, and continually just push the gladiators back without actually killing them. If the unstoppables do spawn, keep in mind you have a period of time after stunning them to potentially still finish the plate, but they do one-shot you with their burst hit, so you need to back up. You can back up pretty much as far as you want in this room, back down the hallway you came down if you really need to make that space and kill the champions. When you first walk into this room, there will be enemies that are already spawned in, and Kargan will be at the back. Shooting him and making him leave the conflux he's standing right next to will cause the next wave to spawn in at a delay. I would recommend doing this right at the start of the room so that a lot more of the enemies spawn in and bunch up and you can kill a lot more of them at once. You do have to be careful of the scions though, because they will group up to the right and you can't stagger them all at once. Usually the last enemy you'll kill in this starting wave will be the unstoppable champion that kind of just sits in the middle of the room. After you've killed all those enemies and you kill him, the first wave will not spawn any other enemies after that besides at the place where you need to dunk the ball. On the second wave, after you've dunked the ball, I recommend staying where you dunk the ball because the enemies will not spawn there again until you clear out everything else and the second unstoppable champion. Killing the second unstoppable champion and picking up the ball it drops will both spawn enemies that are close to you, so I would recommend picking it up and dropping it and going back to the safe spot to kill everything in the third wave before moving over to where you need to deposit the ball. After a few runs, that room is probably the most consistent, as you can outrange or effectively peek all the enemies in it and not ever really be at any risk of dying if you play properly. You'd be surprised how easy it is to die in between these two rooms. Make sure you're always jumping way early to make sure you don't get physicsed, and keep in mind that the blind enemies do not get affected by blinding nades in the same way regular enemies do. They get kind of suppressed, but often will continue to shoot in the direction that you were. Moving into the boss room here, this is probably the place where you're going to suffer the most deaths, and that's mainly on account of this plate mechanic. So like before, these enemies spawn infinitely, but because they're so spread out, it is a lot harder to keep them blind and suppressed. I actually do recommend putting anarchy down at every opportunity here to kill enemies coming out the doors or stagger them, because that'll just lead to you having to deal with less enemies actually coming within your GL range. It takes about 20 to 25 seconds to capture these plates, so the main goal is just time. So anything you can do to keep enemies back, whether that's anarchy on the doors, blinding nades every opportunity, and just throwing your supers or whatever you have when the enemies group up in the middle just to keep them at bay, is recommended. There's nothing that you have to save and can't just throw at the enemies to keep yourself alive and on the plate as long as possible. If you need to abandon the plate, you absolutely can, but you have to clear the enemies and try again. At this stage, the enemies will start spawning even when you haven't stepped on the plate, which makes it a lot more difficult. The only reason I switched to Hunter late in my runs was for these plates specifically, because having Tether just allows you to buy a lot more time than you otherwise would be able to on any other character, and it just covers a lot of the enemies that would give me issues. I learned at about the same time, actually, that killing the dogs, gladiators, and incendiary enemies do not cause further enemies to spawn. When you stand on the plate, dogs and gladiators will spawn, but it's the legionaries that actually cause further enemies to respawn if you kill them. So in between attempts, you can kill everything except the legionaries and then get on the plate, and you'll have a lot less enemies to start with, which will buy you those crucial seconds at the start so that it's easier to finish out. Legionary Grenades continue to be one of the most threatening things in this run, as they can go around corners, around your cover, and can be shot a lot farther away than the enemies themselves will actually shoot at you. If you do get direct stuck, you will probably need to time some sort of damage resistance, whether that's charging a grenade or throwing your super, just to live through it. The other problem with having any gladiators or dogs alive is that their pathing behavior is a lot different from the legionaries and incendiary enemies, which means they will often try to sneak up behind you, hide places that the other enemies won't go to, and will approach from different angles, which often means your blinding nades will not hit them where they will hit other enemies. By the time they get close enough that they do get hit by it, they'll often just walk onto the plate. And fairly consistently, it seems like if you do get held up at all on a plate, you probably aren't capturing it. It's worth mentioning this rock I use is fairly safe, as you can kind of tuck yourself away in it, and the enemies will rarely come around the corner and try to attack you. When they do, you can usually put a nade on them and melee them, and they'll either fall off the map or just back up. When the boss is out, this rock is not safe because the attack that the boss does that goes along the ground will go over to this rock and knock you out of it. And the death barrier is very close below this level, so while it can be tempting while avoiding nades to drop down as a hunter and then use your jumps to get back up, you will die doing this. When the boss is out, the enemies are finite, so while they will occasionally spawn when you do damage to the boss, you can just clear them out and then only have the boss to damage. You can just stay at a safe distance where the attack he launches will not hit you. Be careful of the lines they leave though, because that fire trail can nearly one-shot you if you step through it. Anytime you need to get off of a plate as well, be aware that the geometry that makes the circle around them can actually be higher than the geometry within the plate, which means you can try running at it, and no matter how hard you run into it, it will just not let you up. So often you do have to jump out, even if jumping means you're exposed to more enemies that can shoot at you. On my hunter, I also ended up switching to Rage of the Wormind instead of the Grasp of the Wormind. So instead of being able to pick up the cells, they would just be stuck where they were. But the cells themselves, when they exploded, would do extra damage. And I found just in general, having that final burst of actually killing things was more useful than trying to pick up the cells and actually put them in a place that would be more useful than where they spawned in. Often I found they would spawn in places that would cover different areas, and I could use blinding nades on the other areas and have a larger effective radius to keep enemies blind. And speaking of blinding enemies, it's worth keeping in mind you can't continually blind them. There's just a brief window where they go unblind but they can't do anything quite yet. And if you blind them again during that window, then it looks like you're keeping them permanently blind. But if you miss any enemies, they can't actually be blinded over and over again by hitting them like every 2 seconds or so. It's when you're hitting them in that window right after they've actually lost the debuff. Other than that, try to kill all the regular enemies before you deal with any champs. You don't have to deal with any champions in the boss room. The actual strats for killing champs are fairly simple if you don't know them already. The unstoppables don't heal, so you just stick them with anarchy and wait, or do some damage to them while they actually are stunned. The barriers, you just stick once with anarchy, wait till they shield, break the shield, stick with anarchy, wait till they shield, break the shield, and then kill them. There is no champion that you have to feel forced to kill at any given time. You can always back up and try again later. So if the champion does anything like going around a corner that would force you into a bad position to try to break it, or it heals all the way up, or it backs just enough around the corner that it gets the chance to ready its weapon and starts pre-firing, just do not engage. Take your time, you got this. I hope this video was useful, entertaining, and maybe convinced you to try this challenge out. If you have any lingering questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the comments. And if you have any constructive feedback or ideas for where to go with videos like this in the future, let me know. And have a good day. Or else.
What intel did you discover?